A single metallic click in the Vietnamese jungle. 30 seconds later, an American patrol is torn apart by Viet Cong fire. The weapon that betrayed them wasn't a rifle or radio. It was a Zippo lighter. While U.S. soldiers died carrying these iconic chrome boxes, Australian SAS troops banned them entirely. The reason reveals one of Vietnam's most overlooked tactical lessons. In guerrilla warfare, silence isn't golden, it's survival. March 1968, Quang Tri Province. 4:30 in the morning, that dead hour before dawn when the jungle holds its breath. Specialist Danny Morrison, 1st Cavalry Division, crouched in wet elephant grass with 11 other Americans, waiting for enough light to move. They'd been out 3 days on a search-and-destroy sweep, sleeping in shifts, nerves frayed from the constant tension of operating in Indian country. Morrison's hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from nicotine withdrawal. He hadn't smoked in 6 hours. He reached into his flak jacket pocket and pulled out his Zippo, brushed steel, engraved with his unit insignia and the phrase, "Yea, though I walk." His thumb found the familiar wheel. One flick. The metallic click echoed through the pre-dawn silence like a bell in a cathedral. 30 seconds later, the jungle exploded. AK-47 rounds tore through the grass from 3 directions. RPG trails streaked orange through the gray light. Morrison took a round through the throat before he could even process what was happening. 4 other men died in the first 10 seconds. The survivors, pinned down and surrounded, called in a dust-off that would arrive too late for 3 more. 2 kilometers away, a 6-man Australian SAS patrol heard the firefight erupt. They'd been moving through the same area, tracking the same Viet Cong unit for 2 days. The VC had no idea the Australians were there. The Australians had been close enough to smell the enemy's cooking fires the previous evening. They'd watched VC sentries pass within 20 meters of their position. Not once had they been detected. The difference between Morrison's dead patrol and the invisible Australians wasn't training, firepower, or courage. It was a single metallic click. This is the story of how a cigarette lighter became a death sentence, and how the Australian SAS recognized what American forces learned too slowly. In Vietnam, the smallest sounds carried the heaviest consequences. The Zippo lighter occupied a unique space in American military culture. More than just a tool for lighting cigarettes, it became a talisman, a piece of home carried into hell. The Zippo manufacturing company had supplied millions of lighters to American servicemen since World War II, and by Vietnam, carrying one was practically mandatory. Soldiers engraved them with unit mottos, girlfriends' names, tour dates, dark humor. "When I die, I'll go to heaven because I've served my time in hell." We are the unwilling, led by the unqualified, doing the unnecessary for the ungrateful. These weren't just lighters. They were identity markers, material evidence of who you were and what you'd endured. The ritual of lighting a cigarette provided a moment of normalcy in an abnormal world. After a firefight, after humping through jungle with 60 pounds of gear in 100-degree heat, after watching your buddy get dusted off with his leg missing, the Zippo came out, the familiar weight in your palm, the practiced motion. Flip the lid, strike the wheel, light up, flip it closed. That distinctive click-snap sound meant a brief escape, a pause in the madness. Psychologists would later identify these small rituals as crucial coping mechanisms for soldiers dealing with sustained combat stress. The Zippo represented control in an environment of chaos. You couldn't control when Charlie would hit you, couldn't control the monsoon, couldn't control the incomprehensible orders from rear echelon officers, but you could control that lighter. You could make fire appear with your thumb. Small magic in a world that had lost all sense. Estimates suggest that between 60 and 70% of combat troops in Vietnam carried Zippos. Post-exchange shops stocked them. They appeared in care packages from home. Unlike matches, they worked when wet, critical in a country where dry was a theoretical concept during monsoon season. The Zippo was practical, durable, reliable. It was American manufacturing excellence condensed into 3 ounces of metal and fluid. But that excellence came with an acoustic signature. The Zippo's mechanism produced 2 distinct sounds: the initial flip-open click as the lid's cam lifted from the case, and the closing snap as the lid cammed back into position. These weren't subtle sounds. The mechanism was designed for durability, with metal-on-metal contact creating an unmistakable metallic resonance. In a quiet room, you could hear a Zippo open from 20 feet away. The Vietnamese jungle wasn't a quiet room. It was an acoustic amplifier. Jungle sound propagation follows counterintuitive physics. Dense vegetation doesn't muffle sound uniformly. Instead, it creates complex reflection and channeling effects. Sound waves bounce off tree trunks, refract through layers of different air density, and travel along the ground surface with surprising efficiency. High humidity, nearly constant in Vietnam, increases air density, allowing sound to travel further with less attenuation. Temperature inversions at dawn and dusk create atmospheric lenses that can carry distinct sounds for extraordinary distances. The metallic frequency of a Zippo's click sits in a range that human ears are evolutionarily optimized to detect, 2,000 to 4,000 hertz. This is the same frequency range as a breaking twig or a predator's footfall, sounds our ancestors needed to identify instantly for survival. In the ambient noise spectrum of a Vietnamese jungle, filled with insect drones, bird calls, and rustling vegetation, a metallic click cut through like a knife. Acoustic engineers who later studied jungle sound propagation estimated that under ideal conditions, early morning, high humidity, minimal wind, a Zippo's click could be distinctly audible to an attentive listener at distances exceeding 300 meters. 3 football fields. In practice, experienced soldiers operating in the same terrain could reliably identify the sound at 150 to 200 meters. That was more than enough distance for a Viet Cong ambush team to prepare a killing zone. American military doctrine in Vietnam prioritized firepower and mobility. The philosophy was overwhelming force. If you make contact, call in artillery, airstrikes, helicopter gunships. Pour so much ordnance on the problem that nothing survives. This doctrine came from World War II and Korea, conventional wars where American industrial might could be brought to bear on identifiable front lines. Vietnam had no front lines. The enemy wore no uniforms. The battlefield was everywhere and nowhere, but American institutional culture adapted slowly. Comfort items remained standard issue or readily available through supply channels. The logic was sound from a morale perspective. Soldiers enduring hardship deserve small luxuries. Coffee, cigarettes, hot sauce for the bland rations, and yes, Zippo lighters. These things maintained fighting spirit. What this philosophy underestimated was the learning capacity of the enemy. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army weren't primitive guerrillas stumbling through the jungle. They were professional soldiers who'd been fighting colonial powers since 1945. First the Japanese, then the French, now the Americans. 23 years of continuous warfare had created an institutional knowledge base that rivaled any military in the world. They learned, adapted, and evolved, and they learned to listen. Captured Viet Cong documents, prisoner interrogations, and post-war interviews with NVA veterans revealed a systematic effort to catalog American acoustic signatures. This wasn't casual observation. It was deliberate intelligence gathering. VC units conducted training sessions where experienced fighters taught new recruits to identify specific American sounds. They created what modern intelligence analysts would call an acoustic signature library. The Zippo lighter topped the list. Prisoners interrogated by American and Australian intelligence officers consistently mentioned the distinctive click of Zippo lighters as an indicator of American presence. One captured NVA platoon leader, interrogated in 1969 by Australian advisors, stated plainly, "We could always tell when Americans were near because we would hear the metal sound of their lighters. We learned to recognize it during training. Our instructors told us, when you hear that sound, you know Americans are close and you can prepare to attack or withdraw depending on our strength." But the Zippo wasn't the only sound in the VC's catalog. They learned to recognize the specific crinkle pattern of MRE package mylar, different from the paper and tin sound of C ration cans. They knew the distinctive pop hiss of an American C ration can being opened with a P38 can opener, that tiny folding tool soldiers carried on their dog tag chains. They recognized the metallic rattle of ammunition in cloth bandoliers versus the different sound of linked machine gun rounds. They could differentiate the footfall patterns of American combat boots from ARVN issue boots from French surplus boots worn by Montagnard irregulars. This acoustic intelligence gave the VC an asymmetric advantage. They knew the Americans had superior firepower, air support, artillery, medical evacuation, Direct engagement on American terms meant defeat. But if you could hear the Americans before they saw you, you could choose: fade into the jungle if the enemy was too strong, or prepare an ambush if conditions favored the VC. The 30 to 60 seconds of warning provided by acoustic indicators like the Zippo click was enough time to transform a chance encounter into a planned ambush. VC fighters could identify firing positions, designate targets, prepare withdrawal routes. When the shooting started, they had initiative. The Americans, caught by surprise, reacted. In combat, the difference between action and reaction is measured in casualties. Statistical analysis of small unit engagements in Vietnam reveals a stark pattern. Units that initiated contact suffered significantly fewer casualties than units that were ambushed. The ratio varied by terrain and year, but a representative figure from 1967-1968 shows that American units initiating contact averaged 1.2 casualties per engagement, while ambushed units averaged 6.8 casualties. When you're surprised, you die. The Viet Cong understood this calculus intimately. Their doctrine emphasized, strike when you can win, withdraw when you cannot. Acoustic intelligence allowed them to make that determination before committing to contact. American noise discipline, or the lack thereof, gave them the information they needed. Meanwhile, 200 kilometers away, Australian SAS patrols moved through the same jungle like ghosts. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment brought a fundamentally different approach to Vietnam, one forged not in the classrooms of Fort Benning or Quantico, but in the jungles of Malaya during the long, brutal counterinsurgency campaign known as the Malayan Emergency. From 1948 to 1960, British and Commonwealth forces fought communist insurgents in the dense jungle of the Malayan Peninsula. The enemy were the Malayan National Liberation Army, experienced jungle fighters who'd learned their trade fighting the Japanese during World War II. They knew the terrain, had popular support in certain areas, and could disappear into jungle so thick you could stand 5 meters from someone and never see them. Conventional military tactics failed. Large unit sweeps blundered through the jungle, making so much noise the insurgents simply melted away. Fixed fortifications were bypassed. Overwhelming firepower was useless when you couldn't find the enemy. The British Army's traditional approach, discipline, formation tactics, set-piece battles, was worse than ineffective. It was fatal. The solution came from the Special Air Service, a unit originally formed for desert warfare in World War II but reinvented for jungle operations. The SAS developed a new doctrine: small patrols, extended duration, absolute stealth. They learned to live in the jungle for weeks at a time, moving silently, observing, gathering intelligence. When they struck, it was with surprise so complete, the enemy never knew what hit them. The Australians, fighting alongside the British as part of Commonwealth forces, absorbed these lessons completely. When Australia formed its own SAS regiment in 1957, Malayan jungle doctrine became the foundation. Officers who'd served in Malaya trained the new generation. The institutional knowledge transferred intact. The central principle was noise discipline. Every sound you make in the jungle is a broadcast announcing your presence. The snap of a twig, the rustle of fabric against vegetation, the clink of metal on metal, the human voice, even the sound of your breath if you're breathing hard from exertion. Each sound carries information to anyone listening. You're here, you're this far away, you're moving in this direction, you're this many people. The SAS approach was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Eliminate all unnecessary sound. Selection for the Australian SAS included noise discipline testing from day one. Candidates moved through jungle courses where instructors with experienced ears waited in ambush positions. Make a sound, get eliminated. The acceptance rate hovered around 5%. Those who made it through understood viscerally that silence wasn't just important. It was the foundation of everything else. Tactical skill, marksmanship, physical fitness, all of it was meaningless if you announced your presence to the enemy before engagement. The training regiment at Swanbourne, Western Australia, where the SAS maintained its headquarters, included dedicated modules on jungle sound discipline. New operators learned to identify every piece of equipment that could make noise and how to silence it. Metal components were wrapped with tape or cloth. Carabiners were secured to prevent clanking. Magazine pouches were packed tight so ammunition didn't rattle. Canteens were never filled completely. half-full water sloshes less. Even dog tags were taped together or wrapped in rubber bands. Movement techniques emphasized slow, deliberate placement of each foot. You didn't walk through jungle vegetation. You moved through it like water, disturbing nothing. Branches were lifted and gently released, not pushed aside and allowed to snap back. You froze at irregular intervals, listening, allowing the jungle's normal sounds to resume around you. You became part of the environment rather than an intrusion into it, and you never, ever smoked on patrol. The official SAS prohibition on smoking during field operations wasn't a health measure. It was tactical doctrine. Cigarette smoke carries detectable odor for hundreds of meters in still jungle air. The glow of a lit cigarette is visible at surprising distances in darkness. And most critically, the sound of lighting a cigarette, match strike, lighter click, was an unacceptable acoustic signature. For Zippo lighters specifically, the prohibition was absolute. The distinctive click was too recognizable, too loud, too dangerous. SAS operators were briefed explicitly. The VC know this sound. They've been trained to recognize it. If they hear it, they know Americans are near, and they will assume we are Americans. This will get you killed. Some SAS soldiers smoked. Nicotine addiction doesn't respect tactical doctrine, but they learned to manage it. In secure base areas, smoking was permitted. In forward observation positions or during brief security halts, the approved method was wooden matches, broken in half to reduce flame size, cupped hands to shield the glow, and only after establishing that no enemy were in the immediate area. More commonly, soldiers simply went without. Patrols lasted 1 to 3 weeks. You learned to cope with the withdrawal, or you didn't make it through selection. This discipline extended to every aspect of field operations. Food was consumed cold. No heating tabs that produced smell and required opening noisy packages. Communication was via hand signals. Radio use was minimized and conducted in whispers. Even natural bodily functions were managed to minimize sound. Urinating was done slowly to reduce the sound of stream hitting ground or water. The result was patrols that could operate within meters of enemy positions without detection. Lieutenant David Harry Hartley, commanding a 4-man SAS patrol in Phuoc Tuy province in 1967, spent 3 days observing a VC base camp from a concealed position 70 meters away. His patrol counted personnel, identified weapons, documented supply movements, and called in artillery coordinates. For 72 hours, they remained motionless during daylight, moving only at night to adjust position. They ate cold rations silently, controlled their breathing, and communicated only through minute hand gestures. On the 3rd night, after artillery had destroyed the base camp, Hartley's patrol withdrew. The VC never knew they'd been watched. This was typical, not exceptional. Comparing Australian SAS operational outcomes with American units operating in similar terrain reveals stark differences. During 1966-1971, Australian SAS in Phuoc Tuy province initiated contact in approximately 85% of their engagements. They ambushed the enemy rather than being ambushed. Their casualty ratio was extraordinary. The SAS estimated they inflicted between 100 and 500 enemy casualties for every Australian SAS soldier killed in action, figures that varied depending on how kills were confirmed, but even conservative estimates exceeded 50 to 1. American infantry units in the same province and time frame initiated contact in approximately 40% of engagements. They were ambushed more often than they ambushed. Their casualty ratios ranged from 3.1 to 10.1 in their favor, respectable by any conventional warfare standard, but nowhere near SAS numbers. What explained the difference? Equipment was similar. The Australians used many of the same weapons as Americans: M16 rifles, M60 machine guns, M79 grenade launchers. They had less artillery support and air mobility than U.S. units. The Australian task force was smaller and had fewer helicopters. If anything, Americans had material advantages. The difference was doctrine, specifically noise discipline. The SAS heard the enemy before the enemy heard them. They chose when and where to fight. They struck with complete surprise, and when they broke contact, they disappeared so thoroughly the VC couldn't pursue effectively. Captured Viet Cong documents and prisoner statements reflected fear of the Australian SAS. One document translated by Australian intelligence in 1968 was a VC training directive. Australian soldiers are very dangerous. They move silently and attack without warning. When fighting Australians, place extra sentries and maintain alert at all times. Do not assume you will hear them approach. This reputation provided its own tactical advantage. VC units that believed they might be facing Australians were more cautious, more defensive, less aggressive in their operations. Fear degrades combat effectiveness. The silence doctrine created a psychological effect beyond simple tactical surprise. When the SAS did attack, the violence erupted from apparent nothingness. One moment, the jungle was quiet. The next, you were taking fire from positions you hadn't detected. Your friends were dying and you hadn't heard anything beforehand. No voices, no equipment sounds, no warning whatsoever. This violated the VC's own jungle doctrine. They knew how to listen for enemy movement. Their sentries were trained to identify threats, but against the SAS, those skills failed. The result was disorientation and terror. You couldn't fight what you couldn't detect. Sergeant Bob Kearney, Australian SAS, described it clinically. The VC expected to hear us coming. They'd learned what American units sounded like. When we hit them, they didn't understand what was happening. They were getting shot, and they hadn't heard a thing. It creates panic. Panicked enemy makes mistakes. Mistakes get them killed. The SAS didn't achieve these results through individual heroics or superior physical capability. They achieved it through systematic elimination of sound signatures, including the prohibition of Zippo lighters. Meanwhile, American forces struggled with institutional resistance to similar measures. The U.S. military in Vietnam was not monolithic. Different units had different standards, different leadership, different operational philosophies. Elite formations, long-range reconnaissance patrols, Special Forces A-teams, Marine Force reconnaissance, recognized the value of noise discipline early. These units often trained with Australian advisors and adopted similar tactics. LRRP teams, typically operating in six-man patrols deep in enemy territory, implemented many of the same sound discipline measures as the SAS. They taped their equipment, communicated silently, and avoided unnecessary noise. LRRP veterans who later wrote about their experiences consistently mentioned avoiding Zippos and disposable lighters in favor of matches, or simply not smoking during missions. Staff Sergeant Robert Bob Mahaffey, a LRRP team leader with the 101st Airborne, described his unit's practices. "We learned from the Australians that noise would kill you. We got rid of anything that clicked, rattled, or scraped. Guys wanted to bring their Zippos for sentimental reasons, but I told them, that lighter is going to get us all killed. Leave it in base camp. You want to smoke, use matches, and only when I say it's safe. Most of the time, you just don't smoke. It's not worth dying for a cigarette." Mahaffey's team operated for 11 months without losing a man. They initiated contact in 16 engagements and were ambushed 0 times. They credited noise discipline as the primary factor in their survival. But LRRP and Special Forces represented a tiny fraction of American forces in Vietnam. The vast majority were conventional infantry and mechanized units operating under different doctrine. These units rotated through Vietnam on one-year individual tours, which disrupted unit cohesion and institutional knowledge transfer. A soldier learned lessons through experience, then rotated home, replaced by a new guy who had to learn the same lessons from scratch. Moreover, large conventional units had different missions. They weren't conducting weeks-long reconnaissance patrols. They were sweeping areas in company or battalion strength, securing roads, protecting bases, conducting search and destroy operations. The tactical requirements were different. Noise discipline was harder to enforce across 100 or 200 soldiers than across 6, and there was cultural resistance. American military culture valued individual initiative and personal identity. The Zippo lighter, with its personal engravings and sentimental significance, represented those values. Telling soldiers they couldn't carry Zippos felt like an attack on morale, on the small comforts that made an unbearable situation bearable. Officers and NCOs who tried to enforce Zippo bans often faced pushback. "It's just a lighter. I've carried it through 3 months of combat and nothing's happened. You're being paranoid." This argument came from survivorship bias. Soldiers who'd been ambushed because of a Zippo click were often dead and couldn't argue the counterpoint. Furthermore, The American logistical system made Zippos ubiquitous. They were sold at every PX. They appeared in care packages. They were cheaper and more reliable than disposable lighters, especially in wet conditions. Eliminating them required either official policy from high command or individual unit leadership willing to fight against the current. Some officers tried. Captain Harold Hal Moore, who commanded a rifle company in the American Division, instituted a no Zippo rule after Australian advisors demonstrated how far the sound carried. Moore collected Zippos from his entire company before operations and stored them in the company office. Soldiers could reclaim them when they returned to base. Moore's company operated for 7 months under this policy. Their ambush rate dropped noticeably. Moore estimated that they initiated contact in about 60% of engagements, compared to the division average of 40%. He attributed the improvement directly to noise discipline, but Moore's policy was company-level, not division-wide or army-wide. When he rotated home, his replacement didn't continue the policy. Within weeks, Zippos reappeared. This pattern repeated across Vietnam. Individual units learned tactical lessons, implemented solutions, then lost that knowledge through rotation and personnel turnover. The U.S. military didn't fight a 10-year war in Vietnam. It fought a 1-year war 10 times. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, advisors embedded with American and ARVN units, tried to spread the noise discipline gospel. AATV members, many with SAS experience, conducted training sessions emphasizing sound signature elimination. They demonstrated how far sounds carried in jungle environment. They ran exercises where one team moved with typical American noise levels, while another team, positioned as enemy, identified their location purely through sound. American soldiers who went through these training sessions were often shocked at how audible they were. Corporal James Mitchell, 25th Infantry Division, recalled, "The Australians set up this demonstration where we moved through jungle like we normally would, and they had observers positioned at different distances. We thought we were being quiet. We weren't yelling or anything, but they could hear us from 300 meters away. They identified exactly how many of us there were, what weapons we carried, even that someone was smoking. It was a wake-up call." Units that internalized these lessons showed measurable improvement. But again, institutional rotation meant the knowledge often didn't persist. By late 1968 and into 1969, American doctrine was slowly evolving. Training materials began, including noise discipline sections. Official guidance cautioned against unnecessary sound. Some manuals specifically mentioned avoiding distinctive metallic sounds like Zippo lighters. But cultural change happens slowly, especially in military organizations during wartime. The Zippo remained standard equipment for most American soldiers throughout the war, and the Viet Cong continued to listen for it. The tactical implications of noise discipline extended beyond simple ambush avoidance. Silence enabled intelligence gathering that directly shaped operational outcomes. An SAS patrol that could move within observation distance of enemy positions without detection could gather intelligence impossible to obtain through other means. They counted personnel, identified unit insignias and equipment types, documented supply movements, located ammunition caches, identified command personnel. This intelligence allowed Australian and American commanders to target high-value assets, interdict supply lines, and predict enemy intentions. One SAS operation in 1968 exemplified this capability. A 4-man patrol tracked a suspected NVA supply route through dense jungle in Bien Hoa province for 12 days. Moving only at night, maintaining absolute silence, they confirmed the route was actively used, documented 23 separate supply convoys, and identified a concealed cache site. Based on their intelligence, Australian artillery destroyed the cache and ambush positions were established on the route. Over the following 2 months, coordinated operations interdicted supplies that would have supported an NVA regiment. None of this would have been possible if the patrol had been detected, and they would have been detected if they'd maintained typical American noise levels. The intelligence advantage multiplied over time. Each successful undetected observation mission yielded information that enabled more missions. The SAS built a comprehensive understanding of enemy patterns in their operational area, where they moved, when they moved, how they organized themselves. This cumulative knowledge created something close to omniscience within Phuoc Tuy province. The SAS knew where the enemy was. The enemy had no idea where the SAS was. That asymmetry was decisive at the tactical level, but tactical excellence couldn't overcome strategic incoherence. The Vietnam War's outcome wasn't determined by small unit actions in Phuoc Tue province. The Australian SAS won virtually every engagement they fought, and Australia still withdrew from a war that was ultimately lost. This paradox haunted veterans who returned home knowing they'd been militarily successful, yet strategically defeated. The broader lesson from the Zippo prohibition wasn't about lighters specifically. It was about the importance of small details in high-stakes environments. Tactical discipline, the unglamorous, uncomfortable, boring work of eliminating unnecessary risks, determined survival. But tactical discipline required cultural buy-in, institutional support, and leadership willing to enforce unpopular measures. The American military struggled with this in Vietnam, not because American soldiers were inferior, but because the institutional culture hadn't adapted to counterinsurgency warfare. The military was organized, trained, and equipped for conventional conflict. Guerrilla warfare required different skills, different priorities, different mindsets. Some units adapted, most didn't, or didn't adapt fast enough. Modern American Special Operations Forces have internalized the noise discipline lessons from Vietnam. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Special Forces, Marine Raiders, all conduct operations with sound signature management as foundational doctrine. Training includes extensive work on silent movement, equipment preparation to eliminate noise, and tactical patience. The contemporary U.S. military recognizes what the Australian SAS demonstrated in Vietnam. In counterinsurgency and unconventional warfare, silence is a weapon system. Regular conventional forces have learned these lessons less thoroughly. Noise discipline remains emphasized for special operations units, but receives less attention in standard infantry training. This gap reflects institutional priorities. The U.S. military remains primarily organized for conventional near-peer conflict rather than counterinsurgency. Whether this is strategically sound depends on what wars you expect to fight. The Zippo lighter itself remains iconic. Collectors prize Vietnam-era Zippos with their engraved messages and unit insignias. They're museum pieces, historical artifacts that tell individual stories of service and sacrifice. That cultural significance is legitimate and worthy of respect, but those who carried them paid a price that extended beyond the financial. The comforting click of a Zippo opening represented normalcy, control, a moment's peace. It also represented an acoustic signature that intelligent enemies learn to recognize and exploit. The fundamental dynamic hasn't changed. Modern warfare still involves enemies who learn, adapt, and exploit weaknesses. Sound discipline remains relevant, perhaps more relevant given advances in acoustic sensor technology. The principle established by the Australian SAS in Vietnam endures. Everything you do in a combat environment communicates information to potential adversaries. Controlling what you communicate, eliminating unnecessary signatures, and operating inside the enemy's decision cycle provides advantage. The lesson is simple in statement, difficult in execution. Tactical excellence requires attention to details that seem trivial until they kill you. Specialist Danny Morrison's Zippo, engraved with "Yea Though I Walk," was recovered from his body and eventually sent home to his family in Ohio. It sits now in a memorial display in his hometown's American Legion Hall, polished and preserved behind glass. Visitors see it as a relic of service, which it is. Few consider that it might also have been the sound that announced his position to the enemy waiting in ambush. We can't know with certainty what triggered that specific ambush. Maybe it was the Zippo. Maybe it was some other sound. A cough, a stumble, equipment rattling. Maybe the VC had positioned there regardless of acoustic warning, and Morrison's patrol simply walked into a pre-established ambush. War is chaos. Causation is often impossible to determine definitively. But we know the VC listened for Zippos. We know they trained to recognize the sound. We know they used acoustic intelligence to establish ambush conditions. And we know Morrison opened his Zippo 30 seconds before the shooting started. The Australian SAS approach suggests an alternative history. If Morrison's unit had followed noise discipline doctrine, no Zippos, no unnecessary sound, absolute silence on patrol, would they have survived that morning? Perhaps they would have detected the VC ambush positions through their own observation before triggering the ambush. Perhaps they would have avoided the area entirely, their silent passage undetected. Perhaps they still would have been ambushed, but with enough warning to respond effectively rather than being caught completely by surprise. We'll never know what might have been. We only know what was. The click of a Zippo lighter, a sound measured in milliseconds, producing mechanical action worth perhaps half a watt of acoustic energy. In the silence of a Vietnamese jungle at dawn, that tiny sound could travel 300 meters. That was enough distance for an experienced VC soldier to hear it, recognize it, signal his comrades, and prepare to kill the Americans who'd announced their presence. The Australian SAS understood this equation. They eliminated the sound, accepted the discomfort, and survived at rates that exceeded any other ground combat unit in the war. Their discipline wasn't about heroism or extraordinary capability. It was about systematic elimination of unnecessary risk. American forces learned this lesson slowly, inconsistently, unit by unit, often through casualties that might have been prevented. Some soldiers internalized the discipline and survived. Others carried their Zippos to the end. And for some, the end came sooner than it should have. The metallic click of a Zippo opening is a sound that still echoes through military history, a reminder that in warfare, the smallest details can carry the largest consequences. The Australian SAS heard that echo before it became lethal. They banned the Zippo not out of superstition or arbitrary rulemaking, but from hard-won tactical understanding, purchased with British blood in Malaya and Australian blood in the early months of Vietnam operations. The Viet Cong recognized the click from a mile away, sometimes literally. They learned to associate it with American presence, American vulnerability, American opportunity. That recognition, that acoustic intelligence, turned a piece of Americana into a tactical liability. Wars are decided by many factors: strategy, politics, economics, national will. But battles are decided by smaller things: preparation, discipline, the 1,000 tiny details that separate professional soldiers from amateur ones. The prohibition of Zippo lighters represented one detail in a comprehensive doctrine of noise discipline. That doctrine saved Australian lives and enabled Australian tactical success. The lesson shouldn't have required learning through casualties, but that's often how military knowledge advances. Written in blood, learned too late, passed forward to the next generation with hope they'll be wiser. Modern soldiers training for Iraq, Afghanistan, or future conflicts receive instruction on noise discipline, on acoustic signature management, on the principle that everything you do communicates information. That instruction traces its lineage back through decades of hard-won lessons, including the Vietnamese jungle, where Australian SAS patrols moved like ghosts, while American soldiers died with Zippos in their pockets. The click heard round the world, or at least heard far enough to matter, remains one of Vietnam's enduring tactical lessons. In guerrilla warfare, the loudest sound is often the last sound you make. The Australian SAS understood this truth. Those who didn't paid for the lesson with their lives. In the end, the ban on Zippo lighters wasn't about the lighter itself. It was about recognizing that in warfare, especially irregular warfare against intelligent enemies, nothing is too small to matter. The half-second sound of a metal lid snapping open could trigger 30 seconds of violence that left young men bleeding out in elephant grass, calling for mothers who'd never hear them. The Australian SAS chose silence. They chose discipline. They chose survival. And they offered to teach anyone willing to learn. Some learned, many didn't. And the difference between those two groups was measured in flag-draped coffins. If this story revealed something you didn't know about Vietnam, hit that like button. Not subscribed yet? Subscribe now. We dig deep into the tactical lessons history tried to bury. And drop a comment. What other overlooked details from Vietnam should we cover next? Your insights shape future episodes.